Let's knit the Orkney sweater. Hello and welcome back to What's Millie Making, where I'm Millie and this is the space where I talk about the past, present, and future of my making, mostly knitting. Today's video is going to be a new one for me. It is a process vlog slash overview of me knitting the Orkney sweater by Marie Wallin, which I knit as my Rhinebeck sweater for this year. AKA at the end of August, I decided I wanted to knit a vintage sweater pattern to wear to the New York Sheep and Wool Festival in mid-October. And this is what I ended up with. I have, I think, one video talking about some vintage patterns, and then I've been talking about this project amongst like my podcast episodes, but I just wanted to have this dedicated video to it. So while I was knitting this, I did film some check-in clips talking about my decision-making process and my thoughts while I was at a certain step of the project. Most of the clips are filmed towards the beginning of the project, specifically when I'm knitting the yoke, because that's when all the big decisions were happening. However, I don't think those check-in clips tell the whole story because, like I said, this is my first time sharing this sort of video. So the plan is to intersperse clips of my present self in between those check-in clips to kind of fill in the gaps and share all my thoughts on this project. I've also made a list of, I guess you could say, like topics, headlines that I want to cover in this video. And let me just read them out. How I picked my colors, how I did my color placements, and my overall conclusions on picking colors for Fair Isle projects after quite a few flaps. Overall construction of this sweater as well as the modifications I made. My my steeking experience is a pretty big part of it. And lastly, finally, things I learned from the sweater and I guess just like my overall thoughts. So whatever of those questions I don't answer or address in my check-in portions, I will come back at the end of the video and address them all. To get things started, I should probably introduce the project. Like I said, this is the Orkney sweater by Marie Wallin, and I was inspired to knit this sweater actually from a ready-to-wear sweater. Now, this is a sweater from, I think, like fall winter 2021 or 2022 from Molly Goddard, and I'm sure I'm putting like a picture on the screen somewhere. So this sweater has a Fair Isle for the body, and then they use coordinating colors as stripes for the sleeves, and I just loved this combination. And I had originally planned to actually follow this color palette, but I will talk more on this, I guess, later into the video, but that didn't work out. The Orkney pattern is written bottom up, flat, with seamed set-in sleeves, and it also has color work on the sleeves. So that was basically like the easiest modification I think I did. Instead of doing the color work, I just did stripes. And the pattern I think is available for individual purchase on the Rowan website as well as Ravelry, even though it is from a back issue of Rowan magazine. However, I had this book in my library. This is Rowan 40 Years, 40 Iconic Handknit Designs. I think they published this a few years ago for their 40th anniversary, and I just bought this book secondhand. It's fairly easy to get it secondhand, and it's not that expensive. I think if you are interested in at least like 2 or 3 patterns in this book, it is worth purchasing. And I also think a lot of them are not available as individual digital patterns. The Orkney sweater is because it's a fairly popular pattern. Now, the charts in this pattern are, saying they're horrible is probably a little bit over dramatic, but they are dizzying to look at. I guess I'm much more used to knitting more modern patterns where they do not usually chart out the whole thing, especially when there's no shaping involved. Like this is literally a rectangle. In that case, I feel like most designers nowadays would maybe chart out 1 or 2 repeats of each motif versus the whole thing, because not only I think is this dizzying to look at, I think it's even more difficult to look at because it's in black and white and there's more than a dozen colors used. So the difference from one motif from one color to to another when you're looking at this whole huge thing is very difficult in my opinion. Like I could not knit directly from this chart. So what I ended up doing is I went on Stitch Fiddle, which is a free website, and I just recharted this, and I charted I think like 1 or 2 motifs for the most part, except for the front yoke, which is another thing I'll talk about later on in this video. I will say My experience of buying the individual Rowan patterns when they've basically reissued a vintage pattern has been a mixed bag. A lot of the times it is just like the same black and white chart that they had in the magazine. I think like for one or two that I've gotten, they have colorized it, but it's still like this huge, ginormous chart. So I would say that if my preference is usually for PDF patterns, however, and I would pay more for a PDF pattern. However, because the quality of the PDF pattern is probably just as difficult to follow as the pattern in the book because it's probably just the same exact version, I would buy the book because the book is overall cheaper slash a better value because I do want to knit several patterns from this book. And also something I noticed in the pattern, a lot of times they'll be like, oh, refer to instructions on how to do this commonly used technique on page blah, blah, blah. And they don't remove that wording from the digital patterns, which I find kind of annoying because you're not given those instructions on a different page. Anyways, I didn't really follow the pattern anyways, which I will talk about more. I guess we can rewind to the end of August where I'm winding up some yarn and I can talk about my color selection. Like I said, I had originally wanted to copy the colors from the Molly Goddard sweater, but it just wasn't translating because I didn't have enough colors that way. So instead, I just went in my stash and I pulled out some colors that I had a general liking for. For me, when I am knitting a color project, I really like looking on Ravelry. I'll look at what the colors the designer used. I'll also look at what colors other knitters are using for that same specific project. If I'm using yarn that I already have in stash, I'll also oftentimes look up that yarn to see like what color projects people are knitting with that yarn to see their color combinations. And that's a big source of, I guess, like color work inspiration for me. I did end up finding a different source for my color palette inspiration, but we'll get to that. I keep saying we'll get to that, but I'm trying to keep things chronologically as it happened. From the get-go, I did know that I wanted to knit this as a top-down project because I don't think the length that this pattern is written for would be flattering on me, and I just know that I wouldn't really want to wear it. My goal was to create something more cropped and a little bit boxier because I think that just fits my personal style better, and knitting it top down would make that easier in my opinion. So I cast on basically following the instructions in reverse. Okay, excuse the pajamas. I cast on last night. It looks very, very tiny, and there were some roadblocks along the way. So first of all, the stitch counts were like really confusing me because I forgot that this is knit flat. So it kept saying like decrease X number at the beginning of each row, and I was so confused because I'm like, that's going to make it so uneven if you only decrease on one side. Then I realized you are knitting it flat, so you are decreasing on the beginning of the right side row and then the beginning of the wrong side row. So they do even out. But so I got an idea what it's looking like, but I am going to be ripping this out right now because of a few reasons. One, I think I'm going to change some of the colors. I just think the white looks way too white. I am not feeling it. So this was the white I was using, which is some leftover Blue Skies fiber wool stock. I think this is technically a worsted weight, but it was working fine for this. I wasn't not going to be too finicky. But this is just too bright. It's sticking out too much. So I have two other options. These are fingering weights, non-superwash that I could hold double. So this is Sandnes Garn Sunday in like a very, very pale pink. And I think it would totally match the vibe because I am using a lot of pinks. But if I did want to use something a little bit more neutral, I have this Jameson and Smith colorway in the shade Eset. And this is, I guess, more of like a grayish beige. So these are the two options, and then this is the original. I have a feeling I'm going to be leaning towards the pink, but I think this could work too. I'm going to change the colors in my stitch fiddle chart to see which one I like better. And then the second color I want to change is I'm using a Noro yarn over here. It's the Silk Garden Sock Solo in this colorway that I don't know the name of. And I thought it would add like interesting texture to the sweater, but I don't like how it's looking with the other yarn, so I'm going to substitute this too. This one is a little bit harder, so I think I need to substitute it with something with a similar value. So these are the potential yarns that I could substitute it with. As you can see, I didn't really have any other purples that are, or like pinky purples that are that similar shade that were not Tweedy, or even, I didn't even have any Tweedy alternatives. And since it's Labor Day, all the yarn stores are closed. So again, I'm going to go into Stitch Fiddle and play around with the colors to see which one I think would look best. I'm kind of leaning towards the coppery color, but I also like the brighter pink. These are also both Santa Scar and Sunday, but I just don't know if there's enough contrast with these two against some of the other colors I'm using in the project. This Isayer would give me that purple vibe, but I kind of feel like it's too cool toned for this project. And then the last two, this is Garthenor Snowdonia Sock and Ember, and I am using a different shade of this in the sweater, and I really like how that's knitting up and looking. And then this is another shade of Jameson and Smith in the colorway Wren. This would just add some dark brown to it. So I think, yeah. I guess I technically also have this shade of Sunday, but it's kind of similar to the Garthenor colorway that I'm using. So yeah, that's too similar. That will not work. So back to the mood board. Oh, back to the stitch fiddle chart. The other reason I have to rip this out is because I charted the current pattern repeat that I'm on incorrectly. And like when I was looking at the chart, I'm like, this does not look right. But the chart in the book is just so hard to read. Anywho, I'm not that bothered. This isn't that many rows. Another thing is I don't really enjoy the shaping of this. Like there's a lot of increasing and decreasing, and I just don't like how like jagged it looks. So I'm kind of toying with the idea of just putting the charts into like a simple drop shoulder cardigan pattern. But then I'm kind of like missing out on the shaping aspect of this vintage pattern. I'm not sure. Or if I can find a set-in sleeve pattern that I like the shaping of, maybe like something that's been published a bit more recently. So it might be a writing style that I'm more familiar with. Also, so I have modified this pattern to be top down, but it's actually written to be knitted flat, bottom up, which the bottom up part is fine, but why is this knitted flat? Like it's very, very basic stranded color work. There's no long floats. There's no intarsia. I don't really understand why this was written to be knit flat. It doesn't make any sense to me. But yeah, I got a taste of it. Oh, another thing I realized, it's a benefit of knitting flat. So basically you don't use most of the colors for very many rows. So what I've been doing is a lot of times, so let's say I finish 2 colors and then have to cut those yarns and then join 2 more colors in. Instead of joining them on the purl side, I just slide my stitches over and then start working again on the right side. It's kind of like if you have ever made a fake swatch in the round, instead of swatching in the round, you kind of just like you slide the stitches over and then you pull the yarn behind it to start knitting on the right side again. But instead of pulling the yarn, you're basically cutting it and then joining the new yarn. And that just makes it easy to join on the right side. I honestly don't mind purling color work. It's just a little bit harder to read my knitting. Okay, so that is my check-in. I'm going to rip this out now and redo. I fixed the chart, but I have to decide on the colors and then I will restart it after lunch. At this point, not only was I struggling with my color selection for this project, but I was also struggling a bit with the construction. I just wasn't really sure about the way it was fitting. The top of the shoulders seemed really, really narrow, and yeah, it was just looking kind of funky to me. That's where Ravelry came into the rescue. I find their search function can be very useful as long as patterns are properly tagged. So I ended up looking for a top-down construction sweater with a set-in sleeve that was knit anywhere from a fingering weight to a DK weight gauge, and that was not seamed. I think those are all my stipulations. And I ended up purchasing the Sunshine Tee pattern by Andrea, which is top down, satin sleeve, fingering weight t-shirt. Worked out perfectly. I did end up having to do some math because I was basically working off 3 different gauges. I had 1 gauge, the Sunshine Tee had a different gauge, and the Orkney pattern had a 3rd gauge. At this point, I kind of just like ditched the Orkney pattern, the instructions for it, because I just was not jiving with it. I didn't fully understand some of the instructions, like the way it was written was confusing to me because it's just not a writing style that I'm familiar with. That was it. Just wasn't my thing. I think I'm just more used to a more modern or a different writing style. That's just what I've been knitting in my short knitting career. The math at this point was pretty important for the fit because my row gauge was significantly different than the row gauge in the Sunshine Tee pattern. And because this is a satin sleeve sweater, it was really important to ensure that the armhole depth was not too low because otherwise it wouldn't fit at all. So I did have to change the increased rates of the armhole shaping. So that was like a pretty big math thing that I had to do. But aside from that, it wasn't that difficult to rewrite and adjust the pattern to be at my gauge. Because I have no chill, I have recharted the entirety of this Molly Goddard pattern. And now I'm second guessing if I should just knit this pattern or if I should rechart the Orkney pattern with colors, with a color placement that more closely resembles the color placement of this Molly Goddard sweater. Because my current predicament is that I do not like the way, okay, I feel like I'm holding this on the screen for too long. Okay, so my current predicament is that I just don't like the way that my colors are knitting. Can you even see it? I feel like it's just too bright. I don't know. Was it a wrong choice to pick the bubblegum pink? Because I just really like the way that it looked. But I don't know. It's not doing it for me. So I am torn on what to do. I am definitely rubbing this out again. I just don't know what I'm going to do moving forward, which is the problem. It just looks kind of like cartoony to me. Now we've come back to the topic of colors. So, like I said, the original Molly Goddard color palette wasn't working, so I went on their site and I found a different sweater in their archives that I really liked, and I did end up charting it. And after charting that and playing around with my own colorwork charts for this pattern, I ultimately came to 3 conclusions that kind of just made this project click for me. I was like visually analyzing the charts and looking at what do I like about the Molly Goddard charts that I think is missing in my own charts. So these were my conclusions. Number 1, not everything needs to be high contrast. Mixing areas of low contrast and high contrast actually causes the high contrast sections to pop more, in my opinion. One of my earlier charts, every single motif had high contrast and it was not looking good. Conclusion number 2 was trying to evenly disperse the colors throughout the entire sweater brings balance. So I really wanted the pink to pop in the sweater. So I thought if I use some of the other colors like the blue, the green, the yellow, if I use them too much, then I will lose the essence of pink. However, when I looked at the Molly Goddard sweater, each color was distributed pretty evenly throughout the sweater. Like the blue was used in the beginning, middle, end. Same thing with the yellow, same thing with the green, and it just brought like overall balance to the design. And my last point is kind of semi related to that, but repeating color pairings look good. Same thing, I thought, okay, if I use like blue and green together in one spot and I use that again and again, it will be too much of a focus in that sweater and it'll take away from the pinkness. But actually using repeating the color combinations throughout the top, middle, and bottom of the sweater helped bring balance. And as I continue knitting, I did continue to adjust my color charts to get it to kind of like what I was envisioning in my head. But I really think that these three main points that I figured out was kind of like the breakthrough point for me. And I went from knitting things that I was getting frustrated with because I wasn't liking them despite liking the way that the colors of my yarn looked together, to knitting something that was cohesive and was giving me the vibe of the Molly Goddard sweater, which I was aiming for. Okay, so I have pinned my current cast on. I think this is cast on number 2 or 3, I forget. This version I have knit and I've gotten through a few of the charts. I don't know. That is a bad idea. So I did make a mistake here when I was charting. I'm supposed to invert this motif, so it is the opposite of this motif, but honestly, not the end of the world. I just can't decide if I like the way it looks. I feel like from further away, I like the way it looks, but closer I get, the less I like it, and it's honestly hard for me to pinpoint what I don't like about it. So even if I were to recast it on, like, what would I change? Things I can say I like about it. I like the mix of high contrast charts and low contrast charts. I think if it were all high contrast, it would be too much. And if it were all low contrast, it would just kind of be like lost in the sauce. So that's one thing I like. Okay, I just finished recording my podcast, so I thought I would do a quick check-in on this project since it's been a few days. I think the last time I did a check-in, I was spiraling about ripping out the back. As you can see, I did not rip out the back. I instead went back and I changed the colorwork charts a little bit, but I just wanted to show what it's looking like. So that check-in was on Tuesday. Now it is Friday evening, and I did finish knitting the back yoke. I adjusted the colorwork chart, like I said, and I think I added in like the blue and the green, maybe, but I really like the way it's looking. And I also started the front yoke, and I also added in my steep stitches. I added in the steep stitches, and I have about 5 more rows in the yoke. I ended up charting out the whole yoke because I didn't want there to be a jog when I joined it in the round in the motif, because the body will be joined in the middle of a motif. So that took a lot of time, but I think it was worth it because so far it's looking okay. But after I finish the increases on the front yoke, which I think is like 5 more rounds, I think I'm going to give it a steam block to see how it is fitting. It looks small, but when I look at the original pattern, it does look quite fitted around the yoke. I think because it is that set-in sleeve construction, it is going to be pretty high up. I'm used to like a drop shoulder or a raglan where maybe it goes down, the sleeve will start down here or further down. So yeah, that's probably why it looks so narrow to me, because I'm just like not used to this sort of construction. So yeah, that is my pre-weekend check-in on the Orkney. My goal is to hopefully finish the yoke and get started in the round this weekend. I only had a few more rows left on my yoke, so I got that done today. Here it is. I haven't steam blocked it yet, but I'm actually pretty happy with the way that it's looking, and I can put it over my shoulders. So my main concern with this was the yoke depth, because I've never made the neckline is looking a little big right now because these are the steek stitches right here. So it will actually be, I guess, closer to that. Anywho, my main concern is, so I've never done this sort of set-in sleeve construction. So I'm not used to the shoulders of my sweater like sitting so close to my actual shoulder. Usually like drop sleeve, raglan, saddle shoulder, even contiguous sleeve to some degree, and the sleeves tend to start a little bit further down my shoulder, so I'm not used to this, so it's hard for me to tell. Like, it does look like, see, there's like a little bit of space, and I assume also that when I block it out, it will relax some, so I hope that it's all good. These colors are so obnoxious, but you know what? I'm embracing it. My plan is, so right now, this whole thing has been knit flat back and forth, and That means I've had a million ends. I have a million ends I'll have to weave in. The two colors that I'm using now, one color I have to cut, but one of the colors is used on the next row. But my plan is to cut it anyways because I want to move my beginning of round basically from the side to the center. Because if I have the beginning of round in between where my two steek stitches are, number one, I will not have a jog in the color work because a jog will be within the steek stitches. And number two, I will not have to worry about weaving in the ends, I don't think, because they will just be cut as part of the steek. Modifying the sweater to be steeked was really easy when I was joining the right shoulder and the left shoulder. There's a point where you cast on stitches for the neckline. Pretty standard in terms of sweater construction. And I just cast on 5 extra stitches in the center of that. I did make the 2 outer stitches of those 5 extra stitches to be purl stitches, as it was kind of basically an easy visual identification of where my steek stitches were. And it also came in handy later on when I was sewing the reinforcement for the steek stitches, as well as when I was picking up the stitches for the neckband, not the neckband, for the button band. Honestly, I think the yoke was the most difficult part in terms of construction. After I figured that all out and I joined in the round for the body, it was pretty much smooth sailing from then on. The next major decision I had was when I was knitting the sleeves. Hello with another faceless check-in. It's been a few weeks, but I've just been working on the body and I finished the body. I've put it on stitch holders and I blocked it. Here she is in all her glory. I haven't done the ribbing yet because I'm unsure of what color I want to use for the ribbing, but all the color work is done. I did attempt to start the sleeve. I picked up stitches, blocking the sun a little bit, but it's still pretty bright. I picked up stitches and I started knitting the sleeve, but because of all like the yarn ends and the bulkiness, part of it was just looking really wonky. It was just looking really wonky. So I ditched that and I thought, okay, I already put in so much time and energy into this sweater. I might as well just do the proper sewn in set and sleeve. So this is sleeve attempt number 2, and you might be able to tell from this that this is much larger than my arm circumference. There was just way too much excess fabric, and I thought I could get away with it by doing some rapid decreases, but I don't know if you're able to tell, but it created like a weird pouchy situation because here I was just doing 1 decrease per stripe, and then as I got further along, I started doing 2 decreases per stripe, but that change in the decrease rate created like a weird shape and it was not jiving with the shape of my arm. And yeah, I didn't like just how baggy it was looking, especially because the sweater itself is already quite baggy and it was just looking kind of sloppy. This was like what I primarily knit on this weekend, so that was kind of a bust. And I am currently on sleeve attempt number 3 and it is going well so far. I changed up the color order because I thought this one was looking a little bit too rainbowy, so I made it slightly more random. I also made the stripes thinner, which, woe is me, that just creates more yarn ends, but I do think it looks better with the Fair Isle, the thinner stripes. Now my next thing is I have to find out an efficient way to deal with all the yarn ends around the armhole. I think what I'm planning to do is I'm going to try braiding them together, at least like the ones that are close to each other. There are quite a few along like the shoulders that I'm not sure if the braiding method will work, but hopefully like the ones that are actually along the edge, I can braid all those together and then if need be I can whip stitch them down. I'm planning to seam this in before I finish the sleeve because I don't want to like knit the whole sleeve or get far into the sleeve like I did with that other version and realize it doesn't fit. I would ideally like to do a double knit button band, but I guess it all comes down to timing. Despite thinking I was so clever for finding a pattern where I could pick up stitches instead of seaming, with my color work, it just wasn't working out. It was looking kind of lumpy and the short rows were looking funny. So I decided I'm just going to seam it in. Before seaming, I did end up French braiding all the yarn ends, and that was just much cleaner and also much quicker than weaving them in individually, and it made it easier to seam when I didn't have a bajillion different yarn ends just floating around. And I'm assuming over time that the French braided ends will kind of just like felt into the fabric. I also did the same thing for the stripes on the sleeves, although I still have to do it on the second sleeve. As for the ends on the body, as I predicted, because I joined each new collar in the middle of my steek stitch when I cut the steeks, that really wasn't an issue. As far as the button band goes, I did end up picking up the stitches for the button band before I steeked, because as I was going through this whole process, I watched like at least like a dozen YouTube videos and read a bunch of blog posts to see what the best method for steeking was, and quite a few posts recommended picking up the button band stitches before you cut them, because you are pulling at the fabric when you're picking up stitches, and the less stress you can put on those cut ends, the better. And I learned from this project that the proper ratio of stitches to pick up for a double knit button band is 1 to 1. So the more you know. One thing that I'm sure somebody mentioned it in the various resources I checked before doing this, but I don't remember, is that you really do have to increase the tension on your sewing machine if you are sewing in reinforced steeks, because the first time I did not, and I was like so confused why it looked like the stitches weren't holding at all. And I rethreaded the needle, I rethreaded my bobbin, I was trying to figure out what was happening. Ultimately, I realized, okay, I just didn't have enough tension. I also did shorten my stitch length to be as short as possible. One of I would say the two most useful resources for me that I found when it comes to steeking is one, Mel Makes Stuff has a few videos where she steeks some of her projects, and number two, on the Alice Starmore slash Virtual Yarns website, they have a page with a few different video tutorials covering steeking, and I did follow their tutorial on how to sew down the cut fabric, like the steeked fabric. I don't think I did the best job, and I couldn't 100% understand the video, but honestly, it is holding. I can't notice it when I'm wearing it, and that's really all that is important. I think I talked about how I pick my colors, and I also talked about the color placement and my conclusions on picking colors for Fair Isle. Do I have anything else to say on that topic? I do think it is really useful to look at how the designer originally picked their colors, especially if you're like me and you're picking a color palette that is vastly different from the designer's colors, because I had originally just kind of put in whatever colors I liked in the beginning, but actually looking at the contrast between the colors and the motifs that Marie Wallin used would have helped me arrived at my conclusions a bit earlier, I think. Also, I think cutting down on the number of colors used was also useful, because the original yarn used for this project is Rowan Felted Tweed, and those colors are definitely much more muted. They're like tweedy fabrics. They blend together a lot better than me, who used like 9 or 10 different yarn bases that had different textures. They were all non-superwash, but some of them were like really woolly wool non-superwash. I used some Garthenor, which was kind of like the two twists for two different colors. I used some non-superwash merino, so I had a lot of different textures going on in my sweater. I think once it was like knit and blocked, you couldn't tell, but in the beginning, starting off, I was like kind of unsure about it, because I had originally tried to pick out as many colors as the original pattern used, and it was just too much for what I was going for. Okay, the next question, overall construction of the sweater and the modifications I made. Like I said, I have made many modifications. I ended up knitting it top down. I ended up knitting it steeked. I totally changed the way that the sleeves were knit. I also changed the button band to be a double knit button band. Oh, I think the only other modification that I didn't talk about was for the neckline. Over the summer, I knit the cardigan number 9 by My Favorite Things Knitwear, and I really like the way that the neckband or neckline or whatever you want to call it is knit in that sweater. So when you pick up stitches to do your neckline ribbing, before you start the 1 by 1 rib, you actually do a few rows of double knitting. And the yarn is kind of dark, but I think you can see there's a few rows of double knitting. I think it kind of helps just cinch in the fabric and prevent the neckline from stretching out. Honestly, that is like one of my biggest pet peeves with hand knit sweaters and hand knit cardigans in general. Like even this sweater neckline is a little too loose for my liking. I'm gonna leave it be for now, but I'm pretty sure at some point I'm going to have to put in elastic in this neckline. And I think the double knitting before the 1x1 rib just really helps with that situation. And I think that's something you can kind of figure out yourself, but if you can't or you don't want to, I would recommend buying the cardigan number 9 pattern just for that. I actually when I was looking at the Molly Goddard sweater, I spent a lot of time looking at her Fair Isle sweaters because she puts them out every season, every fall winter season, and they're also beautiful. And I actually did notice on quite a few of her cardigans, she has that same design where there looks like there's some double knit fabric before the 1x1 neckline is put in. So that was really cool to notice. And I could be like, oh, I know how to do that. As for my Steeking experience, I also already talked about the resources that I used. And I put out a reel, and I think I also shared it on shorts here, some of my, I guess, like overall tips that I learned from Steeking. So I guess I can just mention them again here. Number one, use shorter scissors because there is less likelihood of making a large cut that cuts into something that you don't want to be cut. Number two is to put something in hard or solid in between the layer of fabric you're cutting and the other side of the fabric. So in this case, I put a book in between the front of the cardigan I was knitting and the back of the cardigan, which I absolutely was not knitting. Number three is to steek in a well-lit area. I waited until I was ready to steek, I think at night, but I was like, no, I need some natural bright sun to make sure I am really cutting the correct stitches. Number four, go slowly. And number five was if you do put the beginning of the round marker or any joins in the center of the steek, you will not have to worry about weaving in those ends, which is honestly a big relief because that cut out like, I don't know, at least 50 ends that I would have had to would have had to weave in. And finally, things I learned from the sweater and my overall thoughts. Overall, I'm so proud of how the sweater came out. I'm kind of just like in awe. I can't believe that I knit this. I don't mean to brag, but I think this is so beautiful. This might be the most beautiful thing that I've ever knit. I'm absolutely obsessed with it. It made me realize Fair Isle really is not that scary. Like most of the rows of color work are only using two colors. I don't think I ever had to catch any floats. There were maybe a few rows where I had to use three colors, and I just changed those motifs to be two color only. The only areas that I did not are in these like squiggly areas in the center. There were a few rows where I had to use three colors at a time, but that's it. Especially Fair Isle at a DK weight gauge, it really does not take that long. I knit this sweater within like 2 months, and that is with taking a break for a week or two. Oh, this sweater also could be a great use of 100-gram skeins of fingering weight yarn. The only color that I used more than 100 grams of is the dark purple that I use like for the ribbing and the button band and all that stuff. But every other color that I use, I did not use more than 100 grams of yarn. And I think my last conclusion is I find this to be surprisingly wearable, even though it is so colorful and there's a lot going on. I've already gotten a ton of wear out of it, and I already have ideas for other ways to wear it. I think a lot of times in the knitting community, we kind of have a narrow definition of what is wearable, and that's maybe a cream or neutral colored sweater and a plain stockinette stitch. And don't get me wrong, those garments absolutely are wearable. My like beige colored sweater number 23 gets so much wear. However, that is not the only definition of wearable. If you are able to use colors that you already find yourself wearing a lot in your wardrobe and you make it in a shape that you find wearable, I think color work can absolutely be wearable. I think I talked about this a little bit in my fall knitting plans video, how I've been trying to find the happy medium between knitting what is popular or what's interesting me on Ravelry, but also wanting to knit pieces that kind of jive with my personal style and what I'm being influenced from the personal style or like fashion space or whatever. And I think this is one of my first color projects that I can say really hits both. Like, I love the way this affair aisle looks, but it doesn't look outdated to me. Like, this very much looks like something I would wear in the year 2024, and it reminds me of colorwork sweaters that I've been seeing from everywhere, from like Old Navy to Bergdorf's. Yes, that is my Orkney sweater saga. I love it so much. Like I said, if you have any additional questions about this project, please feel free to leave a comment below. I didn't talk about the specific yarns and colors that I used in this project because there are just so many, and for some of them, I ran out in the middle of the project and then I just pulled out a similar color from stash to finish the project. So yeah, there's a lot of yarns involved. However, I did list every single yarn and the colorway I used on my Ravelry project page for this sweater. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to follow along and give it a like. I am already thinking of the next colorwork sweater that I want to cast on. In my Delulu aspirational knitting mind, I want to knit 2 more colorwork sweaters this year, but I don't really know how feasible or realistic that is, especially because I want to also knit on some of my sweaters from the whip graveyard. As always, I would also love to know what you are knitting on or working on while watching this video because I'm nosy and I always want to know that kind of stuff. I think that's everything I have to say for now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you again next time and happy knitting. Bye. Okay, I actually remembered one last thing. If you are a fellow American and you have not done so yet, don't forget to vote. This is an important election for so many reasons. And a not as important reason is, do you want trade wars and 200% tariff on your imported yarns? No, I do not. Okay, that's really the end now. Bye.